This video, following up on the video that you may have just seen, which talks about the false trope, the false dogmatic claim that where there's smoke, there's fire, and suggests that where there's smoke, there's a smoke bomb. That was the last video. This video suggests an alternative possibility, which is where there's smoke, there's an ember. And that ember is fanned into a fire by malice. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Where there's smoke, there's an ember means that there's something happening. Let me use my example, right? Because it's the easiest one to use for me at the moment. Had I been, married at age 22, stayed with that woman, lived in a white picket fence, a dog would be helpful, right? Remained a classical Orthodox rabbi. Remained in a classical monogamous relationship. Not challenged both the sexual mores, right? The theology, the political structures, right? Of the world in which I lived, both implicitly and explicitly. Had I not made mistakes, real mistakes, right? In relationship, then it'd be very unlikely that I'd be suffering the smear campaign. That is absolutely 1,000% true. So I want to acknowledge that. Where there's smoke, there's an ember. Right? I lived in a world in which the only legitimate sacred possibility was classical monogamy, and classical monogamy didn't work for me. And so I did what a gay person in the 50s would do when being gay wasn't a possibility. I lied about sex. I had an occasional affair, right? In order to create a sexual possibility for myself that didn't exist within marriage, that felt to me essential, felt to me as an essential expression, right, of life force. I remember one moment, a dramatic moment on a high holy day service when I must have been 21, something like that. I was at the seminary and we were in the middle of the high holy day service, and it was, maybe the second day of the high holy day, maybe 2:00 in the afternoon. Service had gone on for many, many hours. People were beating their breasts and, praying with great fervor and devotion. And yet underneath the great fervor and devotion, I sensed in the structure something that felt to me not kosher, dead, corrupt, not clear, right? It seemed to me somehow petrified. And I longed for kind of immediate aliveness. So I left the service. You weren't allowed to use money in the holiday, so I jumped the subway, station spot, took a train downtown, right, and spend the afternoon, right, making love with a woman that I hired, right, to make love with. We were completely respectful to each other, completely loving, and that's how I spent the afternoon. And then I took the train back up, again, not paying because you couldn't use money in the holiday, and made it back for the evening service. And it was my attempt, ill-conceived as it was, inadequate as it was, to somehow bring together, right, the erotic and the holy. It wasn't a function of sexual addiction, as my former wife, Chaya, likes to claim. It had nothing to do with that. It was actually a deliberate, right, clear, right, intentional act, right, reaching for something, reaching for a bringing together, an integration that I felt was desperately missing. And in some sense, my entire life, right, has been about how to integrate the erotic and the holy. And it's what I've written about. It's what I've lived. And it's been a process. And I've made mistakes. Absolutely. Affairs are a mistake, right? Absolutely. Esther Perel is now writing about infidelity and the complexity of infidelity, right? I regret it. And yet it was a method of protest. It was a method of saying, this doesn't work for me. It was inelegant. Not only was it inelegant, ultimately it was wrong. It was out of the contract that was possible. And like a gay person in the 50s, right, I lied about sex. I completely regret that. And it was the nature of my path. It was the nature of where I was going. And ultimately, I was able to understand that monogamy is beautiful and holy and sacred. And polyamory, having committed relationships with more than one person, often with a primary partner, is also legitimate and holy and sacred. And celibacy, for periods of time, is legitimate and holy and sacred. So all of that is part of where there's smoke, there's an ember, right? I didn't live a white picket fence, conventional life. I've also made mistakes, right? There was a particular mistake I made right? The one that I most regret, when I was 24, I had a 15-minute limited sexual encounter, right, with someone who was in my youth group. I take full responsibility for it. She was highly initiatory, flirted with me for a couple of weeks, asked me to sleep with her, and wanted to have a continued sexual relationship. Someone close to her has recently written to me that she had stalked me and lied about this story because I rebuffed her advances, which is true. She's told a story about what happened, which is a story of sexual abuse, which didn't happen. Nonetheless, I made a mistake. Right? I had a one-time limited encounter, right, with someone that was in my youth group, right, who was 16, I was 24. It was a mistake, not a pathology, right, not a pattern of pathology, not a pattern of predation, not something that was ever repeated. I actually stopped it, right, as it was happening, didn't allow it to go further, did it in a non-shaming way. And the entire story that this person has told about it, right, is virtually entirely untrue. And I took a polygraph test with the best person I could find in America, which validated my version of events. But I did make a mistake. That mistake has been used, deployed. It's been part of a stalking. It's been deployed cynically. It's been misrepresented. It's been blown wildly out of proportion. But I did make a mistake. Where there's smoke, there's an ember. There's a story that appears all over the web, which seems to suggest that Marc Gafni, right, is involved with 14-year-old girls. Marc Gafni is not involved with 14-year-old girls. A smear activist, if I can coin a phrase, wrote on my Wikipedia page, Marc Gafni confessed to sexual relations with 14-year-old girls. That's preposterous, a complete and blatant lie. And then it added and molested a 13-year-old girl. Not true. What is true is, when I was a teenager, I was 19 years old, an adult, right, I had a limited relationship with a freshman in high school. At the time our relationship began, let me state categorically, she was 14. Her birthday is November 30th. Our relationship began closer to Christmas. We met a couple of months earlier. So there was a period of time, several months, where I had a deep love relationship. We exchanged love letters. There was never a moment in our relationship that seemed to be anything but us being totally in love. We held hands. We spent our afternoons in the Met across from her house in 83rd and 5th in New York. We walked around, right, her neighborhood in Manhattan. I listened to her play her guitar. Right, we talked. We studied. We loved. We never made love. We never had sexual intercourse or anything vaguely approaching. Our sexual contact was limited to above the waist, right, petting. That was the nature of my sexual contact with her, and never anything else. We didn't think at that time in any sense of, age, that literally never entered our conversation in terms of any kind of legal issue. In retrospect, I regret the relationship. It took place in New York. It's not rape or statutory rape or anything similar, nor is it child molestation, which is below 14, which was not the case. So it was a misdemeanor, technically, right? I understand that. I regret it. It's an ember. It was a mistake. It's not pathology. It wasn't predation. The story that this person told, a decade later is untrue. This person, her name is Sarah, is connected with the first story I just told, Judy. They've been connected and in collusion for a couple of decades. Judy has worked closely with a major political adversary of mine. Judy and Sarah together, right, have a therapist named Vicky Pollan, who appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show and said that she murdered babies in a satanic cult, aka not a reliable source. Vicky Pollan, who seems to have manufactured false memories, aka not a reliable source. Vicky Pollan, who said that she was the either therapist or counselor, unclear, but the mentor of Judy and Sarah. And so they came together in a kind of collusion aligned with, significant political adversaries and have told a false story. The best I could do was to take, with the best person I could find in the country, right, an extensive polygraph test, which has validated or supported, right, my version of events. So those are two embers, 1,000%. But those two embers don't translate into virtually anything that's been said in the smear campaign. I made two youthful mistakes. Those were then used, right, as a basis, right, to foment false complaints of sexual harassment in Israel, which were categorically untrue. Did I have, right, relationships in Israel, right, with people in my organization? Absolutely. Were they radically consensual? Everyone agreed that they were, and there's numerous testimony to that. right, a major political adversary, right, a student who I broke ties with because of what I felt were egregious ethical violations. David Ember was a major actor in the false complaints. His close friend, Mia Cohen, was an instigator, the first initiator who began the process of the false complaints. My former wife, Chaya, who I left because I fell in love with another woman, has proudly declared, right, in an affidavit, right, that has been written by a person who she declared this to, that she was a prime organizer of the false complaints. Did I do anything wrong in that whole story? For sure, right? Right. I didn't realize that privacy was difficult for people to hold. Right. I didn't realize that I was vulnerable, right, by having these relationships. They were innocent, they were lovely, they were beautiful, they were provocative, they were edgy, but they were fully mutual, fully consensual. There's an enormous amount of documented evidence that supports that I talk about in a number of videos, right? It's been proven beyond, right, any reasonable doubt, 1 billion%. The complaints were categorically false, right? But I had some part in the contribution system that created the conditions that allowed for those false complaints, albeit unwittingly, albeit I wasn't aware of it. And of course, if there was a contribution system in which there's 100% and I had 5% or 10% responsibility, I need to take 100% responsibility for whatever my 5 or 10% was. But again, that has nothing to do with whatsoever the egregious smear campaign and character assassination, right, and vicious malice that has perpetrated, right, this smear campaign, which has been animated by David and Chaya, who've been major players who are covering up their role in the false complaints, their role in claiming falsely that there were police complaints. And so that's what I mean by where there's smoke, there's an ember, right? I've never sexually harassed anyone in my life. I'm not sexually abusive in any way. You know, sorry to disappoint the mockers, right? The accusers. I'm not a sociopath. If anything, I'm an empath. I love people dearly, madly. I love many people. I'm experimental. I'm edgy. I'm completely committed, right, to creating a better world. I'm completely committed to helping everyone I can. I'm completely committed to goodness. I'm completely committed to integrity. I'm completely committed to transformation. I live my life based on those commitments. I've worked for the last years, many years, with hundreds and hundreds of people in fabulous, productive, gorgeous, beautiful relationships that continue, that have, thank God, survived and even sometimes prospered. Right, in the smear campaign, as we all came closer together, facing this injustice and facing the horror of this kind of internet abuse and this kind of distortion, what Wilhelm Reich called this kind of emotional plague. So where there's smoke, there may be an ember, but that ember is fanned into a fire by malice. And it's always critical to take personal responsibility. But beware of the claims of a false pattern. There is no pattern of predation or abuse. That's utter nonsense. One of the first tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy, right, is what's called false pattern recognition. To know when false pattern recognition is at play, which is the cherry picking of information, the collapsing of a timeline, linking it together in a way which is completely distorted, right? So if you take two youthful mistakes, then put them together with false complaints of sexual harassment 20, 25 years later, right? Then you collapse the timeline, distort what actually happened in the youthful mistakes, right? And then claim the false complaints as true. Then you have, right, a pattern of predation. Well, no, not true. There's no pattern of predation, right? I've never again sexually harassed anyone in my life. I'm not sexually abusive in any way, right? I am, thank God, right? I don't know why I have the privilege to be, right? It's a gift. It's a gift of grace, but I am a loving person, right? Actually, love fills me up and almost overwhelms me with its intensity, right? And I am, right, fully committed, fully, absolutely committed with all my being, right, to the evolution of consciousness, to creating a better world, right, to the dignity of every individual, to the dignity of the masculine, to the dignity of the feminine, right, to creating, right, a new possibility. I'm always open to feedback. I'm always willing to sit with any individual who may feel hurt in the normal arc of human relationships, away from the mask and not hiding behind the mask of groupthink, but actually one-on-one with a facilitator, which we can check facts, take mutual responsibility, and create transformation. But I categorically categorically, for the sake of every leader, for the sake of integrity, for the sake of love itself, reject, right, the smear campaign, reject, right, the attempt to murder my life force, the life force of my entire circle of colleagues and friends and collaborators because of a series of base motives rooted in, right, malice, right, rooted in whatever the interior domains are of those who have perpetrated this abuse. Where there's smoke, there's fire, sometimes. At other times, when there's smoke, there's a smoke bomb. And at still other times, where there's smoke, there's an ember. That ember is then fanned into a fire by false claims of pattern that don't actually check evidence, that interpret the pattern in a particularly malice-filled way. We got to stand against this. It requires discernment. Remember, lies are simple. Truth is complex. But it's only the ability to hold complexity, to cultivate discernment, that allows us to get to truth, right, to goodness and to beauty. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us.